Howdy. This is going to be the last in my Behind the Flinders series. And in this one, I'm going to talk a lot about more of the camera settings, and I'll primarily be focusing on the Gopro settings. I'll also talk a little bit about the settings I use for editing, and finally, I'll touch on color grading. So let's start with Gopro settings, and often there's no right or wrong with the Gopro settings, so I'm going to just focus on my settings, and I'm going to not just take you through what the settings are. I'm going to try and explain to you why I've chosen those particular settings and a little bit about what those settings do. So I've got a couple of GoPros. I tend to use either a GoPro 9 or a GoPro 10 as my main sort of helmet camera, and I have three profiles that are set up on those cameras. And they are called Bike, Activity, and Cinematic. And I'm going to take you through each of those. But the Bike is a sort of fairly new one that I've added in when I was at the Flinders. Because I was riding solo, I knew that if I was doing point of view shots, I wasn't following riders for most of it. So it was more about seeing more of the bike in shot. So my Bike profile uses the super wide lens, and it's actually giving you more of the bike handlebars and the bike in shot. The Activity profile is the one I normally use when I'm actually trying to get a point of view shot. So I want to get some of the fairing, some of the bike in shot, but also typically I might have riders in the distance. And the third one, Cinematic, is when I want to exclude the bike and I'm focusing on another subject. It may be a landscape or more typically it's a rider actually riding in front of me, and I want the camera to be focusing on them. So they're my three profiles. I'm going to put up the settings for all three of these profiles on the video, so you'll be able to write them all down. But we'll walk through and explain the settings for, say, let's have a look at the Cinematic one first. Okay, so let's start in the top left with resolution and frames per second. This can be confusing as there's a lot of options here, and the thing to understand here is that the choices you make here can determine which lens you can select, and it can also determine the hypersmooth settings. So they all kind of interact with each other. So for Cinematic, I actually have this set on 4K. And you'll see there's a 4K in the top row, which is 4:3 aspect ratio, and there's a 4K on the second row, and that's a 16:9 aspect ratio. So I choose 4K 16:9, and for the frame rate, I choose 60 frames per second. And the reason I choose 60 frames per second for Cinematic profile is because if I do want to slow it down, this is the profile I'll use if someone's going to hit a muddy pool of water, or they're going to do a jump, or they're going to do something exciting that I may want to slow down afterwards. 60 frames a second will give me 2x slow motion really smoothly. So that's what I choose. If we go to across now, looking at the lens, I choose linear plus horizon leveling. So the linear, it's the third narrowest lens, so you don't get as much sort of fisheye distortion. And it also gives you sort of the rider closer in frame. So the linear lens is quite good from that perspective. And the horizon leveling is quite nice, because even if my camera is sort of off center slightly, it'll still automatically level the horizon. Now that does create a bit of extra cropping, but I don't mind, because I'm typically zooming in, or I'm looking at subjects a bit further, so I'm happy for that extra crop factor. So that's my lens setting for Cinematic. Hyper smooth, I turn up to boost. And again, when you turn it up to boost, it does involve a little bit of extra cropping, but again, I don't mind, because I'm not going for that super wide shot. And boost just gives you a much smoother, it's more of a sort of flowy shot, especially when you're following. It almost looks like you're a drone following the riders in front. So that's my hypersmooth setting. The next row I leave off. Schedule capture off, duration, no limit, I don't use that. And hindsight, I leave off as well. And the reason I don't use hindsight is because I'm not leaving my camera running all the time. Hindsight's only good if you've got your camera turned on. What it does is, if you're not recording the action but your camera's turned on and you have hindsight enabled, if someone has a crash in front of you or something happens, you can actually click the button and it will actually start recording like back in time, so 20 or 30 seconds earlier. It's just buffering that video. But as I said, I don't use that. And timer off and ignore the zoom. Okay, Protune settings. I leave these the same for all of my profiles, and I'll go through and explain, try and explain why I choose each of these settings. Bitrate, I have high. And the reason I have that high is I just want the highest quality. So that's basically, it's talking about the amount of compression that it's using. So I have a high bit rate to get the maximum quality. Shutter, I leave that on auto, and that's because the shutter is going to be the main thing that actually adjusts my exposure. EV comp, I have that at minus 0.5. So it's half a stop underexposed. And the reason why I set it that way is because I personally hate it when I see clouds being clipped. So if the clouds get overexposed, they just turn into this white mass and you lose all the texture out of the clouds. I don't like that, so I'd rather it be underexposed because I can adjust it in my color grading anyway. White balance, I leave that set to auto. I find it does a pretty good job, and it's just one less thing for me to play with. When it comes to the ISO setting, I think this warrants a little bit of a discussion because I've actually changed my thinking here and I'm still actually doing some experimentation, and I'll try and explain why. On the Flinders ride, I was playing around with the cameras, and I kind of had this aha moment where I realized that the GoPro was not behaving the way I was expecting it to behave. And what I mean by that is, first of all, the GoPro is terrible when it comes to any sort of exposure aids or exposure information. You don't know whether the exposure is right. You don't know what shutter speed it's running at. You don't know what ISO it's running at. So you kind of just have to make assumptions. And I was working off an assumption, which is pretty standard with photography, that if you're kind of using auto ISO, usually the cameras won't start cranking up the ISO until the shutter speed starts dropping below something that's quite reasonable. And generally in photography, that's around about 1/60th of a second. So cameras that are set with auto ISO, usually the shutter speed will slow down to about 1/60th of a second, and then the cameras will say, okay, I don't want to go any slower than that. So they will start cranking up the ISO from typically 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 after the shutter speed drops to about 1/60th of a second. So I was kind of assuming that's the way GoPro would work, but I don't believe that is the case. I actually think that the algorithm in GoPro is actually designed to create a faster shutter speed. And so I believe what's happening now is if you have your ISO, minimum ISO, say at 100 and maximum ISO at 800, which is what I was doing, I think that GoPro is actually starting to turn up the ISO much earlier in order to try to keep the shutter speed really fast. And what that means is if you're using ND filters, it's kind of working against itself because you put the ND filter in to slow the shutter speed down, but then as the shutter speed slows down, GoPro's cranking the ISO back up, and that actually speeds the shutter speed back up again. So it's working against itself, and you actually have the added problem of extra noise in your image due to a higher ISO. And so what I've started doing now is fixing the minimum ISO at 100 and the maximum ISO at 100. So I'm actually saying to GoPro, okay, you can't play with ISO now. You can only adjust the exposure with shutter speed. And first of all, I'm finding now I'm actually getting much more motion blur. So it's clear that was occurring. But it also means you've got to be a lot more careful now about the ND filter that you're putting on. If you go too heavy with the ND filter, so if I'm running an ND 32 because it's sunny and then I go into shade, often my image can be underexposed or the shutter speeds can be too long. So I think I'm actually going to, my next shoot, I'm actually going to try setting the minimum ISO to 100 and the maximum ISO to 200. So I'm just going to have one stop of latitude. But that's kind of what I'm currently playing with and experimenting now, just to find the optimum range for that. And I'm also going to just take a little bit more care now when I'm placing my ND filters to make sure that I'm not going too heavy with the ND filters. So if anything, I'm going to err on the lighter side of an ND filter, which means in bright sunlight, I'm probably going to shoot with an ND 16. And then in overcast cloud, I'll shoot with an ND 8. And if I'm riding trails where it's quite dark, I'll probably take the ND filter off altogether. Color. Now, because I am doing color grading, I have this set to flat. Okay, but if you're not planning to color grade, you should set that to GoPro, okay, or normal, whatever the normal one is. The reason why I like it set to flat is because it's compressing, it's reducing the dynamic range of the contrast of the image, and you're less likely to lose detail in the shadows and the highlights. It's much easier if things are a bit muddy and compressed to actually pull them apart and expand them in color grading and post-production. So, but that does, if you don't then do your post-production, your images are going to look flat and they're going to look pretty muddy. So only set that to flat if you are planning to color grade. Otherwise, leave it on GoPro. Raw audio, I leave that turned off. And then wind, I just leave that on auto. But I'm typically using an external microphone for monitoring or capturing reasonable audio without the wind noise. So they're my Protune settings. Now we'll just talk about the differences in the settings. So my main point of view profile is called activity, and now for this, if we start with the resolution and frame rate, I'm using 4K 4:3, okay? And so that's the one in the top row on the left. And I'm using a frame rate of 30 frames per second. And the reason why I use 30 frames per second is I hardly ever slow down the video from my helmet perspective. And so it just means that I'm saving a lot of space, and I don't need to record 60 frames a second if I'm editing in 30 frames a second. So let's talk about the why I use 4K 4:3. So what you need to understand is the GoPro sensor is actually 4:3 aspect ratio. So when you're normally using a 16:9 setting, it's actually not recording basically data from the top and the bottom of the sensor. So you're actually getting less data captured. When you put it on 4:3, you're opening it up to capture the maximum data. And that means that in the editing, I've actually got more image that I can slide up or down the frame to actually set the composition. That's quite useful for point of view shooting, because often, depending on your head angle, when you're riding, you might be looking down or you might be looking a little bit more up, and that's actually changing your camera angle. So I'm giving myself more slip, more wiggle room in the editing by setting it on 4:3. I can actually just adjust it up and down the frame. So that's the resolution and frame rate. So 4K 4:3, 30 frames per second. The lens I set on wide, and that gives me enough of my handlebars and bike and shot without the sort of crazy distortion that you get with Super View. And my hyper smooth is on. Okay, they're the only three settings that change in this profile. Okay, largely the bike profile, which is the one I was using in the Flinders to go with a super wide lens just to get more of my bike in shot. I was using 4K, not 4K 4:3, and 30 frames per second. And the reason why I was using that is because I wanted to use that super view, that super wide lens. I cannot use that with a 4:3 capture. So I have to be 4K, which is 16:9, and 30 frames per second. And then the lens, I was using super view, and hyper smooth was on, okay? And Superview, I don't normally use it because it just does create too much sort of fisheye distortion or barrel distortion. So, but I did think that it was warranted in the Flinders because there was no riders that I was ever following. So anytime I was shooting GoPro, it was about my bike and my bike's point of view. So they're my main GoPro settings, and that's why I choose those particular ones. So let me put them up on the screen for a moment, and you can just compare them. You'll see that all three of them use the same Protune settings, so that's common. And then you can just see the differences between the three profiles that I've set up. One thing that's worth mentioning, so the way I use GoPro, I don't just keep it recording while I'm riding. I have quick capture turned on. And quick capture means that the GoPro can be sitting on my helmet totally off, and then I just tap the button once, it powers the GoPro up, it starts recording, and then when I'm finished, I tap the capture button again, and it stops recording and powers down. So that way I save battery, I save storage, and I save a lot of time in the editing as well. In this section, I thought I'd cover just some of my basic settings for editing. It's not going to be a full tutorial on how I edit. I've already created one of those, so if you haven't seen it, go into my channel and you'll see a playlist there with about 6 or 7 episodes on my approach to editing. But this will just cover some of the major settings that I use in my editing. Okay, I use Adobe Premiere Pro as my editor. And again, this is not a tutorial on how to use it. I'm just showing you my specific settings. I've created a project in Premiere Pro. Now, probably the first thing that's worth showing is my sequence settings. So if I go in and create a new sequence, you can see here, I've got 2 presets, Brent's 16:9 and Brent's 2:1 widescreen. So most of the time when I'm editing my videos, I'm using this 2:1 widescreen. And if we have a look at the settings for this, so my time base is 29.97 frames per second. Essentially 30 frames a second is what I'm using to edit on, but this is probably the most important stuff here. The frame size, so I edit at 1920. Now normally HD video is 1080, so 1920 by 1080, and that's the 16:9 aspect ratio. I use a shorter height. So I deliberately edit on a 2:1 ratio. I kind of like that slight widescreen format. I just think it looks a bit more cinematic, and I just really enjoy that. So I basically have edited this to say 960 horizontal. So now when I say it's done, it's created a new sequence for me. And just to sort of explain what that widescreen looks like, I've got 2 GoPro videos here. Let's start with this one. So this is a normal, okay. So this is a normal 16:9 video. So you can see, if you look here, you can see I shot it at 4K. So it's 4K 16:9. And if I just play this bit of video, okay, that's what it looks like. Now, when I bring this down onto the timeline, so first of all, it's going to complain. It's saying, hey, your clip does not match the sequence settings. I keep my existing settings. And what you'll notice here is it's zoomed right in. So it's actually showing what you're looking at now is that's at 100% magnification. So at 100% magnification, I've got a lot of wiggle room to sort of play around with the framing and composition of this particular video. So normally I'll back it off to around about 50%. And at 50%, that's now sort of, I've filled my frame to the left and right, but I've got a little bit of slippage for sort of fine tuning my composition. So if I wanted to show not much bike, I would run it like this, okay? But if I wanted to show more bike, I can still slide it up like this. Okay. And that's kind of what you get. One of the benefits of by going by a 2:1 aspect ratio. I'm shooting 16:9, so I've actually got this extra wiggle room just to fine tune the framing when I'm doing my editing. And of course, it also means then it's kind of looks slightly widescreen, which I also like, especially for sort of more panoramic type content. Now, by contrast, if I bring in this other video, if I have a look at this other video, this is one that I have shot with my activity profile, and you can see the aspect ratio is 4:3, so it's closer to a sort of square. Now, when I bring this content in, and now have a look at it, let's go to that. Again, you can see it's zoomed in because I shot it in it's kind of 4K. So if I now go through and just adjust my scaling, you can see if I go all the way back out here, now I see the whole height of my image, but you can see that's scaled at 25%. So I've actually got, if I go up to 100%, okay, that's without losing any resolution. This is what I've got a ton of image that I can move around to actually adjust the framing. So typically what I'll do is I will back that off. Let's bring that back here. So I will widen that out so that I just get my width, but look at all of the sort of slippage that I've now got to adjust the framing. So I could sort of run that. We're hardly seeing any of my bike at all, or I could run that, which really, that same shot, but really emphasize the bike. So that's why I like shooting in the 4:3 generally, because in the post-production, in fact, I can almost totally cut out my bike. Oops. I can almost totally cut out my bike and just focus on the other rider, or I can really emphasize and compose that more like this. So that's generally how I choose to do my editing. I like that 2:1 aspect ratio. I use 30 frames per second. And when I'm shooting in 4K, it just gives me a lot of composition options. So if I go back to this first one, which is 16:9, again, I can actually choose, if I double click on that, I can, without losing any resolution, I've got quite a lot of latitude in how I frame that image up because I've shot it at high resolution. So they're my major editing settings when it comes to time base and resolution, etc. In this last section, I thought I'd talk about color grading. Now, I know probably 95% of you have no interest or desire to color grade, so you can just shut the video off now. But for those of you that are looking to try to get just better quality videos and images, I do want to kind of make the case for why color grading does make your videos stand out. So it's not a full-blown color grading tutorial, but I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of how color grading can sort of just transform your images and give you a lot more control over them. So I've got 3 images here, which I'm going to just sort of grade and just show you how I process them. So this first one is a drone shot, and the drone doesn't shoot in flat color, it shoots in normal color. So coming out of the drone, the images look pretty good. That's totally raw off the drone. I have bumped the drone's exposure down to -half a stop, just to, again, keep the detail in the clouds and make sure I don't lose the clouds there. So this can actually benefit a bit from a little bit of color grading. And then I've got 2 I've got two just set of GoPro shots, and you can see these were shot with a flat color profile and also low sharpening. So this is what they look like straight off the straight out of the camera with no effects applied. And so we'll have a look at a before and after on these as well. So to do the color grading, I actually use a third-party plugin called Cinemagrade, but you can actually use the tools built into Premiere if you want, but I'll just show you what I use. So I've just added the effect onto here now, and if I go into my effects control panel and say open Cinemagrade, now it actually opens up my Cinemagrade panel, and this is what I do my color grading in. So looking at the scopes, so 100 means it's pure white, 0 means it's black, and what this shows is that a lot of my picture is kind of sitting up to about the 75th percentile. So it actually shows me it's underexposed. Now with this, I can just press E, and then I can use my mouse to actually bump that exposure up. So it's a visual editor, so I can actually say, for example, exposure, I can hit C for contrast, okay, and I can hit S for saturation. And so with the keystrokes and the mouse, you can actually correct very quickly, or you can bring out a side panel with the sliders, and you can actually adjust here as well. So I'll just manually do it with the sliders so you can see what I'm doing. So I've bumped the exposure up by about 2 stops. The highlights look fine. I'm not losing any detail out of my clouds. Midtones also look fine. Shadows are a little bit high. You can see from the scopes that they're up a bit high. So I'm going to bring my shadows down a bit. About there. Saturation's not too bad. If I wanted to just give it a little bump for sort of dramatic purposes, I could. And that's not too bad. So if I have a look at before and after, you just see it sort of really brings that to life. So that's my first image done. Now I just hit my down arrow key and I'll go to my second image, which is my GoPro. So because this is flat, I usually start by just immediately adding in about 20 points of contrast, or let's go 25, and then I add in saturation. So that's kind of just bringing it back up to sort of almost a neutral type setting. Again, you can see my whites, I'm a little bit off here, having them dead white, so I might actually just add a little bit more exposure. That looks good. My blacks are good. They're just, if you look at the bottom of the scope, they're just touching the bottom here. So I'm not clipping any blacks, but they look pretty good. And if I wanted to add any more contrast, I don't think I need to. I think that looks pretty good about there. So again, before, after. Looks much better. And let's go to my third image. Same deal. If you can see in the scopes, there's no highlights here. It's pretty flat. So I'm going to give it a contrast boost, and then I'm going to increase the saturation, and then I'm going to bump up the exposure. I'm just looking at the whites here. It's sort of, I don't want to lose too much detail in the sky. I can give those midtones probably just a bit more of a bump up here. And maybe a little bit more contrast. I'm mainly going by eye. So before, after. And it may be a little bit warm, so I'll just cool that down a tad. Before, after. Okay, so now I've actually corrected all 3 of my shots. So here are the 3 shots that I've got. The last thing that I can do is I can actually do a final grading. And the final grading is kind of like the look and feel of your image. So it's almost the best way to describe it is you can apply filters, what they call Luts or lookup tables, to alter these. And I've got a ton of different Luts here, which I've either bought or downloaded or found, etc. Some of them are preset film stocks. Some of them are they're kind of like just filter packs that you can buy. So I've got a couple here. So these ones here, GoPro, Matte Como Red, Matte Como Gold, etc. These are some preset ones that tend to be sort of like favorites that I use quite a bit. Let's go. So if I go and have a look at, let's apply this one, and I go accept. Now immediately it looks disgusting. It's way too strong. So I can then dial down the strength. So I can go from 0 to full, and often I'll bring it down, I'll put it in somewhere around about 50 or so. And now that's applying it to all three of those images. So if I now have a look at, let's go, if I go back to those other images, that's the first one, second one, third one. And again, if I just go back to before, after. Now for that image, I think that effect actually looks great and the strength's not too bad. If I go back to this one, I think the saturation's too strong, so I can go back to my original base correction and I can just drop my saturation back a bit. Look at the final graded image, and that's not too bad at all. And then again, with this one, it's clearly oversaturated, so I can go back to my base correction and I can just bring that saturation back a little bit. And that's not too bad at all. Okay, so in fact, this one, I probably just, to match it up, I could probably just go to that base and boost it a little bit more. And then what I'm going to do is on my final grade, I'm just going to take all the saturation back a tad. So now I've got shot one. There's the first shot, second shot, third shot. And so now I would accept those and I'll save all of those grades. So now they've gone back, apply changes. So now it's actually been applied in Premiere. So in Premiere, if I come up here, I can look at before, after. And the other thing I'll do is the drone has done sharpening automatically, but my GoPro, because I shoot with it in a unsharpened or low sharpened manner, it's actually very soft. So what I do is I will apply sharpening to this. And I've got two types of sharpening that I do. One of them is an all over sharpen. So if I grab that all over sharpen effect and drag it on here, you can see it's immediately sharpened that up a bit. And if I go off, on, you can really see it. If you look at the tree here, off, on, and I can dial that to strength. If I want to go like over the top, you can kind of really, really crank that sharpening up. So this is over the top. Let's make it over the top just to show you the contrast. So before, after. So I would probably normally run it around about 100. So before, that's unsharpened, sharpened. So that's an all over sharpen. The other type of sharpening that I'll do is where I'm emphasizing like this motion blur, like this, I will only actually sharpen the stuff that's in the middle of the screen. So I'll leave this blurred stuff blurred even more. So I've got a center sharpen, which I bring in here. And what that center sharpen is doing is it's applying the sharpening, but it's actually, there's a mask. So there's a circular mask that means that effect is only being applied in the middle. So if I'll just adjust that a little bit. So now the sharpening is only going to happen here, and this sort of feathering means you don't notice it. So if I now, so that's what it's doing is you can see it's sharpening the center of the screen, but I'm not sharpening anything on the side. And so if I go back and have a look at that, having just the center of the screen sharpened, again, draws your eye to here, and it creates a more cinematic effect. So the final thing that I'll do, just to finish the image up, is I actually apply a vignette to my images. So if I come down here and I say New, and I go to Adjustment Layer, it's automatically got the correct settings for my width, height, and time base. And I'll say OK. Now I'll drag that adjustment layer on, and I do this sort of right at the end over the top of all of my edit. And then to this adjustment layer, what I'm going to do is I go to my effects, and I'm going to add in this Lumetri Color onto it. So now, if I have a look at my Lumetri Color here, I've got my various corrections, but I'm going to go to my vignette, and I usually dial in like about a minus 1.2, and just make it strong so you can see what's going on here. Okay, so if you look at let's go, say, 75%. So you can see by making it sort of too strong, you can see the impact of the vignette. But what I usually do is I usually just back that off to about minus 1.2. And now if I go before, after, you can see the impact of the vignette. And it's obvious when you're looking at it now, but typically you don't notice it that much. You don't notice it that much when you're watching it. So you almost don't even notice the vignette's applied there. But if I turn that off, before, after. Again, it just helps to draw your eye to the center of the screen, and it helps to create that sort of more cinematic look. Anyway, that's it. That's just... I'll finish up, and I'm just going to show you. I'm just going to throw some music down, and I'll kind of show you the contrast with those images. I'll do a wipe going across so you can see what the ungraded versus graded footage looks like.